Next is our panel segment on the Nvidia 4060 Ti and the AMD 7600. Both of these released last week, and I believe the embargoes were lifted last week as well, allowing for the reviews on these to release specifically the benchmarks and other numbers, other recorded numbers. We talked about the 4060 Ti on episode 7 of Last Week in Gaming, and that was Brian that also covered that segment for us. Overall, and I'll just start us off, Brian, before transitioning here. Both cards were reviewed based on the ones I've read to best target 1080p gaming. However, the marketing, my impression is that there was an attempt to appeal to gamers that prefer the 1440p resolution. I'll say that arguably, if in case you agree or disagree on that, but that again is at least my impression. So I'd like to organize this in two sections where we have our first section, as you see on the screen here, a section where we are comparing the card specifications. And then for our next part, we can look at one source from TechSpot and talk about frame rates and what has been experienced in games and whether those average frame rates have any meaning for what gamers will see if they decide to pick up either of these two cards. And I will say, let me talk about the pricing. The 4060 Ti has gone for $399 and the 7600 has gone for $270. It was originally $300, but it was marked down to $270. We have sources in the description if you'd like to look at anything that we are talking about, any details. So feel free to look into that. So Brian, I could talk about what we're seeing here as far as the specifications. We can organize this where we look at first the 4060 and compare to the 3060, or we could just jump right in and just talk about the differences and similarities between the 4060 Ti and the RX 7600. But let me first start. Let me get your impression thus far on the releases and what stood out to you for the releases.
So, a couple of key things here is the RX 7600 was originally right at the same price point as the 4060 Ti. Allegedly, was what the projected price point was going to be. In response to the 4060, they actually dropped their price.
Mm-hmm.
Now, bear in mind, the 7600 is not going to be the last iteration of this card. If you look at the previous years, there's always been, another variant of the card, whether it's a XT or XTX, whatever. So this will be basically the equivalent of a 4060, base 4060. So the 4060 Ti, there's another key point to this one. So a lot of folks are going to be kind of hesitant about going to an 8 gig card. And that's rightfully so. Most of your AAA games to even run at 1080p look at the new Star Wars game. The Jedi Survivor.
Yep.
That game is known to take up 10 gigs of VRAM. 10. So you're going to be able to play some AAA games, but you're not going to be able to play all of them. These are both going to be stopgap type cards, and you'll see that when we go to the actual frame rates. Again, when you see these price points, remember when you see the data, remember the price points of these two cards. One thing to point out about the 4060 Ti is the reason why we have the 3060 Ti specs up next to it as kind of a comparison is there's one very glaring difference between the two, and that's your memory bus. There's only 128-bit memory bus for the 4060 Ti. I'm not completely sure what caused Nvidia to make that design choice. It was probably something to do with manufacturing costs, but they haven't made 128-bit cards in a long time.
That's a
At
great
least
observation too.
not in a mainstream card, at least not in something that isn't a budget, $200 ordered online from a third-party manufacturer card.
And the distinction in the memory bus, we did cover that in one of our daily gaming updates too, when it was last week for the initial releases.
Right.
I think it was. We did talk about that.
Now Nvidia claims, and you'll see this again in the frame rates, they claim that the 32 megabytes of L2 cache helps to alleviate a lot of those performance issues that you get from a half the memory bandwidth. Yes and no. Yes, it helps, but as long as you're running DLSS. If you're not running DLSS, you're not going to get anywhere near mid-range settings on 1080p. And you might not even you're not going to be pushing ultra settings on most of your games either. This is not that type of card. This is a card for an intro builder, building it for a kid, or you're building a budget rig. This is not for high-end gaming. This is for, very amateur level builds.
And that was a point too that you reiterated for episode 7 as well. And for those looking, you have the L2 cache on the 4060 Ti at 32 megabyte compared to 4 megabyte on the 3060 Ti. So that is a significant increase there. Some other, what stood out to me, just to keep us going here, are the cores, the number of cores between the 7600 and the 4060 Ti. The cores for the 4060 Ti is 4352 compared to 2048. The boost clock on the 7600 is 2625 compared to 2540. And the memory bandwidth is actually the same for both cards, the 288 gigabit per second on the 4060 Ti and the 7600. But unlike the comparison with the 4060 Ti and the 3060 Ti, the comparison between the 7600 and the 6650 XT, it looks like they kept that bandwidth the same at 288 there. So they didn't perhaps take that Nvidia move for cost. The die size, it looks like, for the 7600 is slightly larger than the die size for the 4060 Ti. So we can transition to looking at the numbers, the average frame rate. Yeah, I think that's what people want to get to, and that is what I was interested in as well. So right here, this is a table that the channel built. It is taken from data provided by TechSpot, as mentioned earlier. But before we start talking about it, I do want to say the drivers are unknown for what's being run on the 7600 and the 4060 Ti. So I don't know if we should assume the press drivers are running for the 4060 Ti, but just to be transparent on that, TechSpot used a Ryzen 7 7800 X3D CPU, and it was paired with a Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master motherboard. And the system they use is using 32 gigabyte of RAM, and is using that is DDR5-6000 CL30 RAM at that. So let's jump in. Go ahead, Brian.
That build, their test build, I think, is a little inaccurate. The reason I say that is because if you look at somebody who's going to put together a budget computer, they're not going to be using an Aorus Master motherboard. They're not going to be using 32 gigabytes of RAM. They're most likely going to be using 16 gigs on a budget like Asus tough gaming motherboard or something like that.
Yeah,
not
system. Absolutely.
Yeah, they're not going to be on an Aorus Master. So again, I would take these results with a grain of salt across the board, because your system that you build is going to have different bottlenecks than a system that's built with premium parts across the board. And then we're going to throw a budget GPU on there and call it a good test. So right off the bat, you can see the differences in the numbers. There's about a 30% difference. And if you gauge it by price, again, it's about a 30% difference in cost, if not more. So, it makes sense that the numbers would be different. So it's not to say that one company's beating another. You're getting the performance for the value. It's just going to be a matter of, do you have the extra $100+ to drop on a graphics card? Or you could take that money difference and say, okay, you know what? Let me get a graphics card that's a little bit less because that's easier to upgrade. And then I'll just get 32 gigs of RAM. Or, or if you're that person that has to prioritize parts of their build, and like this kind of card is what's for you. But again, it's all about personal preference. You're looking at pretty solid frame rates across the board. I mean, for 1440p gaming, I mean, yeah, it's not there. But again, we don't know what drivers they were using. We don't know if they were using Fidelity FX. We don't know if they were using, we really don't know what things are being used.
Yeah, I wish they had the specifics on that to understand if, DLSS.
A lot of these, they will turn DLSS off. But that was actually something with the press drivers. Even if DLSS was off, it was enabled by default. They found that bug. So again, until we can confirm the drivers, or until actual production drivers, hit a good pace, I'd like to revisit these numbers when the 16 gig TIs come out.
Yeah,
because then they'll have had a few driver releases, and those cards will come out, and then we'll be able to test. We'll be able to look at the numbers across the board for what they're showing with the production drivers.
Yeah, and that will be in July that we can do that, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
I'm trying to recall, it's the first half of July that speculated the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte is going to release, and then the 4060 will be the latter part. I think I have that right. Though what I wanted to talk about, see if we have any thoughts on this. We're seeing, based on these numbers, we're seeing higher frame rates, average frame rates with the Nvidia 4060 Ti compared to the RX 7600 Radeon. We did just talk about how there are more cores with the 4060 Ti, approximately double. We're looking at 4,000 versus 2,000. Does that directly correlate to why we would see greater average frame rate compared to the 7600, or can it just be simply the driver, or is it a combination of the both?
So there's an interesting factoid here, and what's not covered by these numbers. There is a review that was done by I don't remember. It was one of the videos I sent you. I think it was Nexus Gaming.
Okay.
Or it was Linus. It was one of the two. But when they ran the benchmarks for making, doing the video rendering, and for image rendering and stuff like that, like Blender, doing the Blender renders and stuff, the 7600 was actually outperforming the 4060 Ti, and that was purely because of the memory bandwidth. So if you're doing video heavy applications such as video encoding or video editing, photo rendering, things like that, the 7600 will actually perform better in those areas right now. It's a weird, wacky piece of engineering, but it works. I highly encourage everybody to check that out. But yeah, it's kind of one of those flip of the coin things, and I think whatever you decide to do, it's not going to be if it's a decision for right now, good on you. These cards, they're not going to be able to play AAA gaming on medium settings right now. So medium settings will become low settings in about 3 years. So keep that in mind when you're building this stuff. If it's something to get you by for now, or if you're looking to replace a old Pascal type GPU, absolutely go for this. But I would wait to see what happens with the 16 gig card first.
Yeah. And you mentioned too that there is a niche for the 4060 Ti. What I'm wondering is these cards, can they, yes, we're looking at numbers here for average frame rate. The idea is you buy it, you use it for gaming, but can it serve another purpose other than gaming, just as a living room multimedia PC where you have Kodi, for example, and you're watching movies off of that with Kodi.
Good job. Good luck with the 4K encoding. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is you might end up buffering with a card that's only got 128-bit memory bus when you're talking about 4K video encoding and decoding.
Yeah, so maybe if you have those old DVDs, perhaps that might be better.
I mean,
480p, 720p.
But you got to remember when you're talking gaming, I mean, yeah, gaming is going to push your system hard. But when you're talking about even watching 4K movies, once you stick that slider over to 4K, it puts a lot of stress on your system, whether you realize it or not. So, I mean, the occasional 4K video, sure, but if you're trying to get, raw AVI file type things you're going to be able to push the video if you're going to use it as a media server. But if you're doing a direct connection to a 4K TV, you're going to be lucky to get 60 frames out of it.
An ISO file would be a no-go there. I take it.
If you're watching compressed 4K, yeah, it'll probably work.
Yeah. Any other concluding thoughts on our segment here for the two graphics cards?
I think that this release is something that it needed to happen. I think both companies kind of got a little bit of egg in their face over this because people were expecting performance cards. They were expecting next gen cards if they're going to be part of this line. What they weren't expecting was that you're just getting kind of more of the same. And something that is an answer to people that haven't updated since their 2080 Ti, or their 2080 card, their old 1080 card or what have you. Those types of people could benefit from this. It's a cheap upgrade and they'll be able to still play current games. But this is not for your folks that are playing the highly detailed rendered games like the newer AAA games like Jedi Survivor or even World of Warcraft now with all the particle animations and stuff like that. You'll be lucky if you don't crap out at 5 frames per second during a boss raid. So keep that stuff in mind too.
Depends on what you play. So yes, we will look forward to July doing another segment looking at how drivers can affect these numbers. And that, I think, will be our segment on the two graphics cards for the show tonight.